Let me remind you of something most people spend their entire lives misunderstanding. The limits you experience externally are often reflections of the limits you accepted internally. No limits exist except the ones you believe in. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Wayne Dyer. Most people believe their life is controlled by circumstances, money, environment, background, opportunity, luck. But long before reality limits a person, belief limits them first, because belief shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes results, and repeated results become identity. That is why two people can stand in the same environment and see completely different futures. One sees limitation, the other sees possibility. The difference is not reality, the difference is belief. Wayne Dyer once said, "You'll see it when you believe it." Most people live the opposite way. They wait for proof before belief. They wait for evidence before confidence. They wait for success before effort. They wait for opportunity before preparation. But belief comes first. Everything in your external world is responding to your internal conditioning. The thoughts you repeat, the fears you protect, the standards you tolerate. All of it creates reflection. Your life mirrors your dominant mindset. If your inner world is filled with doubt, your outer world reflects hesitation. If your inner world is filled with confidence, your outer world reflects action. This is why limiting beliefs are dangerous, because they rarely feel like beliefs. They feel like facts. I'm not smart enough. I'm too late. People like me don't succeed. I'll probably fail. Those thoughts seem harmless, but repeated thoughts become internal laws. Internal laws shape behavior, and behavior quietly creates reality. That is why some people stay trapped for years, inside invisible mental cages, not because the opportunity didn't exist, but because they unconsciously rejected it before it appeared. Napoleon Hill once said, "Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve." The key word is believe. Belief controls action. Action controls momentum. Momentum controls outcomes. If you believe growth is possible, you begin moving differently. If you believe transformation is impossible, you stop trying before the process begins. That is how limitation works, quietly, internally. Most people are not defeated by reality. They are defeated by interpretation. Interpretation determines emotional state. Emotional state determines energy. Energy determines execution. Execution determines trajectory. Everything begins internally. That is why no-limit thinking is powerful. A no-limit person does not ignore obstacles. They simply refuse to worship them. They refuse to let temporary conditions define permanent identity. Because conditions change, identity expands, potential evolves. But most people shrink themselves before life even tests them. They assume failure, they assume rejection, and they assume weakness, and assumptions become self-fulfilling. Wayne Dyer once said, "You are not stuck where you are unless you decide to be." Decision is power, but power begins with awareness. Awareness of what you repeatedly tell yourself. Listen carefully to your internal dialogue. Does it empower you or weaken you? Does it expand your thinking or restrict your imagination? The mind responds to repetition. What you repeat internally becomes emotionally believable, and what becomes believable begins to direct your behavior automatically. That is why identity matters so much. If you identify as weak, you hesitate. If you identify as powerful, you pursue growth. Identity drives action. Most people attempt to change their life without changing their self-image. But your self-image acts like a thermostat. No matter how much external success appears, you unconsciously return to what feels familiar internally. That is why lasting transformation requires internal reconstruction. You must rebuild the way you see yourself, not through ego, through awareness. The no-limit person understands something critical. The mind expands through exposure. Exposure to better ideas, exposure to stronger environments, exposure to disciplined thinking, exposure to possibility. Once the mind experiences expansion, it becomes difficult to shrink again. That is why growth often begins with a shift in perspective, a new conversation, a new realization, a new level of awareness. Suddenly, the limits that once felt permanent begin to look temporary. And temporary limits lose their power. Earl Nightingale once said, "We become what we think about." That statement is deeper than most people realize because thought repetition becomes emotional conditioning, and emotional conditioning influences behavior automatically. If you constantly think about fear, your nervous system prepares for danger. If you constantly think about opportunity, your nervous system prepares for action. Thought shapes state. State shapes execution. Execution shapes reality. This is why protecting your mind matters. Your environment feeds your identity. The conversations around you, the information you consume, the people you tolerate, all of it influences your belief system. If everyone around you thinks small, small thinking becomes normalized. If everyone around you fears risk, fear becomes familiar. But familiarity is not truth. Many people inherited limiting beliefs they never questioned. Beliefs about money, beliefs about success, beliefs about worthiness. Inherited beliefs become unconscious programming, and unconscious programming controls life quietly until awareness interrupts it. Awareness changes everything. The moment you recognize a limiting belief, you weaken its control because now you can challenge it. Is this actually true? Who taught me this? Why do I keep repeating this story? Questions create disruption. Disruption creates possibility. Possibility creates expansion. That expansion is where transformation begins. The no-limit person constantly expands perspective. They refuse to remain mentally stagnant. They study, they learn, they evolve. Not because they are naturally fearless, because they understand growth requires mental flexibility. Wayne Dyer once said, "If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change." Perspective changes emotional response. A setback becomes a lesson. A rejection becomes redirection. A delay becomes preparation. The event remains the same. The interpretation changes, and interpretation changes outcome. That is the power of internal mastery. Most people try to control the external world first, but the external world often reflects the internal state. If your inner world is chaotic, your outer world eventually follows. If your inner world is disciplined, your outer world begins organizing itself around that discipline. Everything mirrors identity. The no-limit person understands this deeply. They stop waiting for permission. They stop waiting for confidence. They stop waiting for certainty, because certainty rarely appears before movement. Confidence grows through action. Action builds evidence. Evidence builds belief. Belief strengthens identity. Identity reshapes reality. This process compounds quietly. One courageous decision, one disciplined action, one expanded perspective, small moments, massive transformation over time. Most people underestimate the power of consistent internal alignment. Alignment between thought and action, alignment between belief and behavior, alignment between identity and execution. When alignment appears, energy changes, focus sharpens, decisions simplify, momentum accelerates because resistance decreases. The internal war quiets. That is when growth becomes powerful. Not because life becomes easy, because identity becomes stronger than fear. Fear never disappears completely, but a no-limit person refuses to let fear dictate direction. They move anyway. Les Brown once said, "Too many of us are not living our dreams because we are living our fears." Fear-based living shrinks potential. Possibility-based living expands it. The difference is mindset. Mindset determines whether pressure creates collapse or transformation. Pressure reveals identity. If you believe you are weak, pressure confirms weakness. If you believe you are adaptable, pressure builds resilience. Belief changes response. Response changes outcome. This is why no-limit thinking is not fantasy. It is strategic psychology. It changes how you approach challenge. It changes how you interpret failure. It changes how long you persist. And persistence changes everything. Most breakthroughs happen after the moment most people quit. The no-limit person stays longer, pushes further, learns faster, adjusts quicker. Because they are not emotionally attached to limitation, they understand something important. The current version of you is not your final form. Identity evolves. Potential expands. Capability grows through use. The mind strengthens through challenge. That means your future is not trapped inside your current self-image. You can evolve beyond it. But evolution requires repetition, daily reinforcement, daily focus, daily awareness of the thoughts shaping your identity. The thoughts you protect today become the reality you experience tomorrow. Protect empowering thoughts. Protect disciplined thinking. Protect possibility. Because possibility expands action, and action expands life. The no-limit person does not deny reality. They simply refuse to let temporary circumstances define permanent identity. They understand that every powerful transformation in history began first as an invisible belief. Before companies existed, someone believed. Before movements expanded, someone believed. Before greatness appeared externally, it existed internally. That internal vision created external reality. Your future operates the same way. What exists inside you consistently eventually reflects outside you visibly. Your discipline reflects externally. Your confidence reflects externally. Your self-respect reflects externally. Everything mirrors identity. That is why inner work matters. Not because it sounds motivational, because it shapes reality. Your beliefs influence your choices. Your choices influence your habits. Your habits influence your trajectory. Trajectory determines destiny, and destiny changes the moment belief changes. Wayne Dyer once said, "You cannot always control what goes on outside, but you can always control what goes on inside." That internal control is freedom. Freedom from limitation, freedom from inherited fear, freedom from self-imposed ceilings. Once the mind expands, life begins expanding with it, because the world often reflects what you consistently believe you deserve. If this message reached you at the right time, stay connected to ReMyndU. Because sometimes the biggest limitation in your life is not the obstacle standing in front of you. It is the invisible belief inside you, quietly convincing you that you were never capable of becoming more.